So it's the first time to be in Australia, and I'm very happy that this could be a good opportunity to make you confident with the importance of Hannover as a center of German art scene. So the dialogue between painting and photography is as long as photography's history, with its ups and downs. Gerhard Richter's oeuvre is the best example for a really fruitful dialogue which has a complex structure. The paintings of Gerhard Richter tap into just this dialogue between different medias. For Richter, his engagement with amateur photography in the private and the public realms became a crucial point of departure for his own paintings. In these works, photography provides a recognizable point of reference, but it is not in fact technically present. It is both mimetically adapted and surpassed by painting. You have seen it in the exhibition. Initially, these two mediums were thus clearly distinct from each other in Richter's work, which is, with a few exceptions, also true for the found photographs that Richter has been assembling in his atlas since the 60s and 70s. You see it here and also in the exhibition. The active mingling of these two pictorial techniques also has a long history. Broadly speaking, the origins of that history lay in the perceived deficiencies in each medium, which could be elevated by the other medium. However, in the late 20th century, as digitalization was taking off and opening up untold new creative possibilities, there were no logical technical reasons or social or aesthetic expectations that could explain why a person would decide to overpaint a photograph in oils. Following some initial experiments in 1987, the exploitation of a new pictorial form by Gerhard Richter from 1989 onwards in his overpainted photographs marked an important new departure in both art history and art theory, and my lecture will focus on both these sides. Richter single-handedly turned the conventional dialogue between painting and photography, as I think, into a new pictorial hybrid. In order to explain precisely what I mean by this, I will first outline certain aspects of the context that gave rise to these pictures and will conclude by looking more closely at the nature of these small format works. Since the overpainted photographs have hitherto predominantly been discussed in the context of the development of Richter's own oeuvre, I will mainly consider his handling of oil paints and photography in light of the recent history of photography. So let me start with two important examples. One important contribution to the practice of overpainted photographs is seen in the work of the Austrian artist Arnulf Rainer. Richter was not in contact with him, but there is documentary evidence in 1964 at the latest that he knew Rainer's overpaintings, although this is not to say that Richter was necessarily influenced by them. The application of paint to photographs, which had been part of Rainer's praxis since the 1950s, was similarly determined by his response to the image in question. However, Rainer's technique, reminiscent of art brut, was distinctly expressive in its gesture, which showed that the reworking was in part about concealing the original image. I think it's evident by this example. It is not only the external appearance of these images, often in the shape of a cross, that clearly indicates that Reiner's negations can be seen to allude to a Christian tradition of banning certain images. So this banning of images has a long history in European tradition. Naturally, it goes without saying that a stance of that kind is entirely alien to Gerhard Richter. Another interesting use of overpainting, which Richter cannot have known, is seen in the work of the Portuguese artist Helena Almeida, specifically in the Pinturas Habitada, inhabited paintings, she did in the 1970s. These works by Almeida took the form of a series of black and white photographs of stage actions, overpainted, as you see, in monochromes. Whereas Reiner's overpaintings were painterly responsive to the motifs in found photographs, Almeida was reacting to a stage photograph taken specifically for this purpose, in which she herself was the protagonist. The outcome of this is a narrative sequence in which the act of partially concealing the image can be seen as a conceptual process. Painting and photography here literally interconnect and endorse each other in the process. In terms of their contents, these works not only enact a self-referential paragona between the different mediums, they also raise the question of gender-specific representation. In both examples discussed here, there are two distinct differences to the later overpainted photographs by Gerhard Richter. Firstly, those colored overpaintings from Richter were all done on Almeida and from Reiner were all done on black and white photographs, which was simply the norm for amateur photography at that time. By the 1980s, things has changed to the extent that color photography was now the norm for amateurs, as we see in Gerhard Richter's own family photographs. Secondly, Reiner's and Almeida's positions were painterly reactions to a given image, which was very different to allowing chance to play a part in the creative process, a factor that is not only central to Richter's art in his more recent works. To continue, let's take a look at photography in Düsseldorf in the 1980s, an important passage of now contemporary German art history. If we look at the historical context of Richter's first overpainting photographs, it also makes sense to take account of his own biography. It is worth noting here that besides studying at the Art Academy in Düsseldorf, Richter also taught there as a professor from 1971 to 1993. He therefore witnessed the establishment of the first chair of photography at the German Art Academy. The first appointee was Bernd Becher in 1976. He's normally working together with his wife, Hiller, but as a German professor, for bureaucratic reasons, you can just fulfill as a single person this position. In view of this, it may not be entirely absurd to speculate that Richter's sudden engagement with photography in the late 1980s could in part have been a reaction to the positive reception of Düsseldorf photography. As it happens, it was in 1988 that the description "from the class of Bernd Becher" first became a recognizable label. This new appreciation of the work of artist photography in Germany also marked the advent of a large format photograph, the tableau, as Jean-François Chevrier called it in 1989, which is fundamentally different to Gerhard Richter's small format overpainted photographs. Or to put it in another way, at a time when photographers who had trained in Düsseldorf were establishing international reputations with large format works, Richter set out in exactly the opposite direction. Here is an example of Andreas Gursky exhibition, and you see how large these photographs are. Nevertheless, it is interesting to note that Richter was also rapidly becoming a point of reference for those Düsseldorf photographers, which readily apparent from the work of Thomas Struth, Thomas Ruff, and Andreas Gursky, so the three stars of the Becher School. It is confirmed in the euphoric comment by the former rector of Academy, Caspar König, quote, "The entire Becher class, from Thomas Struth to Andreas Gursky, cannot probably be understood without taking into account the presence of Gerhard Richter. It wasn't just Becher, it was also his antithesis, Gerhard Richter." Quotes end. Thomas Struth enrolled at the Düsseldorf Art Academy in 1973, where he first studied under Gerhard Richter before transferring into the class of Bernd Becher, where he remained until he graduated in 1980. He, so Struth, was quick to recognize an affinity between Richter's approach and his own interest. In 1989, Struth said, quote, "Therefore, some years later, I understood my fascination for Richter and why he was interested in my work and liked it. Because I think it is, in some way, rather similar to his. For example, in Richter's abstract paintings, you could speak of an attempt to connect dislocated images and then represent them on one canvas. The roots of that, in Richter's work, are maybe psychological or perceptual concern. Can we trust pictures?" Quotes end. This kinship with Richter, suggested by Struth, also comes through in various portraits that Struth made of Richter. See, for instance, this portrait, Gerhard Richter in the Reina Sofia, Madrid, 1994. Richter was thus not only a kindred artistic spirit for Struth, but also served as a subject for his photographic work. A similar affinity with Richter, albeit in a more sublimated form, is seen in the work of Thomas Ruff. Although there was no personal contact between the two artists, there are motivic parallels between certain groups of works by Ruff, particularly his nudes, and those of Richter. Although Ruff himself has always played down any creative or thematic affinities, it is interesting to note one appropriation in Ruff's series newspaper photographs, which are dated from 1990 to 1991. And you see here the example, Ruff's Tsai, is it called 068. It is a photograph of a reproduction of Richter's painting Motorboat, a motif that Richter himself painted twice. These images and the shared skepticism regarding the power of pictures encompass the full extent of the common ground between the painter and the truly purist, yet conceptual photographer. The work of Andreas Gursky makes for a more fruitful comparison. Reference has frequently been made in the literature on Gursky's work to his photograph Untitled from '93 and its affinity with paint techniques used by Richter. The first comparison that comes to mind is with the gray paintings done by Richter in the 1960s and 1970s. You see here one example, and if you compare it, it's very close. Which, like Gursky's color photograph of the gray carpet in the Düsseldorfer Kunsthalle, this was entitled, raised fundamental questions concerning the function of pictures. As the art historian Maren Polte explains, quote, "The color gray is to Richter as the carpet is to Gursky, a void filled from end to end, whose meaning is only apparent on a meta level as the thematization of the specifics of that genre. In the case of photography, this is the replication of that which is there to be seen yet now barely recognizable. Gursky hides physical reality in full view, preventing the viewer from taking it in. Photography does not relinquish its connection to the object, but it does turn it into an enigma and thus daringly tiptoes into the elevated realms of painting, into abstraction. Gursky dips into Richter's box of tools and uses it to dislodge the laws of photography and, in so doing, to turn the spotlight on them." Quotes end. Gursky's interest in painting is confined to the medium of photography and its potential for abstraction, while for Richter, photography only served as a tool to analyze the visibility of painting. The question remains as to whether this is still the case in the overpainted photographs, which have barely been alluded to in these comparisons with the work of Düsseldorf photographers. In addition, there is also the question of how we are to read the direct confrontation between painting and photography in these works. Just to make it clear, the positions in painting and photography discussed in the previous parts of my lecture mostly date to an earlier time than Gerhard Richter's overpainted photographs. In other words, they can be seen as the backdrop to the works Richter has been producing since '89. The comparisons made here highlight four aspects of Richter's innovative works. First, Richter generally works with color photographs, the type an amateur might take since the 80s. Second, this kind of, I would call it, anti-aesthetic amateurism also accounts for the usually small formats and the intimacy of the pictures, which is radically different not only to the work of artist photographers in the late 80s, but also to the painting of that period in Germany. Third, although Richter's methods involves selecting certain photographic motifs and an element of discrimination in the color range of the paints supplied to the photograph, in essence, the overpainting photographs are all about the chance interaction between oil paints and a photograph. The artist then considers the quality of his calculated randomness. Is it a work of art or not? This is the question of the artist. Fourth, despite certain photographs being developed and reused more than once, the nature of the paint application means that these are always one-offs, which decides the question of technical reproducibility in favor of the manual method. Not least, this last point already indicates that Richter's overpainting photographs clearly have nothing to contribute to the history of photography, in the narrow sense that conservative art historiography still clings to. Maybe I belong to this tribe. The interaction between photography and painting investigated by Richter creates a new hybrid medium where painting is still dominant, the still dominant partner, although the end result is distinctly different to his earlier photo paintings. Unlike the latter, where the original photograph generally only exists in the imagination of the viewer looking at the painting, with the result that its contemplation is only one, albeit important, part of the pictorial experience, the overpainted photograph exists as a real object in its own right. It is not about illusion. It can exist without any original. It is what it is, to refer to Frank Steller's famous dictum. This is true of the photograph, but all the more so of the often thickly applied paint substance. The paint does not reinforce the photograph, but rather, as an opaque substance, conflicts with the image. In the case of the abstract paintings, with numerous squeegees layered of paint or obliterating or blurring any composition, the process of the genesis of the picture is partly sublimated in the final appearance of the work. Not so in the overpainted photographs, which can be created by means of one rapid splash contact or a single pull of the squeegee. And it is for precisely this reason that this confrontation of two different mediums prompts the viewer to ponder more deeply the act of painting and its potential failure. In view of this, I should like to propose that these hybrid pictures by Richter should henceforth not be categorized as overpainted photographs, as they always are, but with greater and at the same time simpler precision as paint on photographs. The reference to paint emphasizes the materiality of the paint substance. In Richter's case, the picture carrier to which the paint is applied not a canvas, it is photographic paper. The picture ground is therefore not neutral. Given that the texture of a picture is already of importance in other instances, the visual component of the smooth, highly reflective foreground is all the greater in these paint-on photographs. The inbuilt contradiction gives the picture a productive ambiguity which it would not ordinarily have as a photograph. At the same time, however, the application of paint neither reinforces nor negates the photograph. Instead, it sublates the differences between the two mediums, which nevertheless still pertain in the hybrid pictorial object, which has its own singular position in the history of images. So, not to blame you anymore, my last sentence. Apart from this, there are some rare examples in Richter's work where the overpainted photographs anticipate paintings. You have in mind this one, which is in case with the work from 1989, the overpainted photographs, and Chicago here from 1992. But that's a different topic which I can maybe discuss with Dietmar or anyone else. Thank you.
So we were running a little behind, so we do have time for questions.
Stefan, you quoted somebody early in your paper, I'm not sure who it was, but the quote was something about can we believe images or can we believe pictures, one of the two. It strikes me as a really salient point, and it sort of goes to the heart of a lot of what Richter appears to be doing. You know, what can we trust? The photograph or the painting or a hybrid of the two.
Yeah, to interrupt you, it's the wrong question, but anyway.
It's the wrong question?
Yeah, it is.
I was just, and just yesterday I read something that Wim Wenders has just recently talked about in relation to a little show of his Polaroid photographs, and he was beginning to talk about the death of photography. He said that he's not sure what it is that's replaced it, but he's talking about photography as something that is past. I was just wondering, as a curator of media and photography, what you might have to say about that.
Yeah, well, so the metaphor of the end, even with painting or photography, has a long, non-ending history. So, but both photography and painting is still existing. So I'm really annoyed by the repetition of this metaphor, which reveals that it is also a wrong question, and maybe Wim Wenders is becoming too old, that he thinks that it could go on. So this is just the only psychological answer I can give to you. But I think with this respect, the paint on photographs, or as they are called by Richter himself, the overpainted photographs, you see that there are different or new solutions to this problem, which is in fact not a problem, but a theoretically problem which should be solved by the theory. But yeah, the artists are given better answers than the theorists, I think, if I got it.
I'm going to push a parallel question that's a little bit harder. I'm very interested to know just how committed you are to the idea of the hybrid. Do you really see the overpainted or paint-on photograph images as hybrids?
As what?
Hybrids.
Hybrids, yes, I do.
Combinations.
Yeah.
Not necessarily obviously associated question, but it is in a way. With your last point about the overpainted photograph occasioning a new painting in Chicago, what became of the photograph that was at the beginning of the process? I understand the idea that the overpainting is the artwork, and that Richter has not designated the original photograph as an artwork, that it only becomes an artwork once he overpaints it. But where in this equation is that beginning step in the process? And certainly I'm betraying something of my own uptake of the overpainted photographs by saying that I see them as being not just failed hybrids, but necessarily failed hybrids, in order for them to enact the sorts of relationships that you've described, in order for them to be able to say something particular about painting and about photography that we wouldn't know unless the two were brought together. But in bringing them together, they kind of spring apart. And it's almost like that last example with the Chicago work sees the actual springing apart again.
I don't know if this is really a contribution to me or a real question.
No, I'm really interested in the idea of the hybrid and how committed the idea of hybridity, or how central the idea of hybridity is to your arguments. I mean, it's a very genuine question.
So the argument with hybridity is, I think, obvious because it's a contradiction in itself. Such an artwork isn't a contradiction, and it's not a negative term to me, hybrid, but I think it's a new positive
But is it a positive
solution.
term? That's my question. And,
yeah.
Suggesting
In fact, it is. Yes, of course.
Yeah, that's what I was hoping to get to. So thank you.
And I think that in the history of art, if you are looking back, a lot of works come from this hybridization of classical genres. And so, but this is a hybrid which has a tendency towards an old category, namely the history of painting, but also a tendency to the history of photographs, but it doesn't belong to each of it. And this is what strikes me and makes it interesting to me to focus on that.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. They're fascinating. Thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. It's nice to be here in Brisbane. I've never been here before. I can remember a time 4 or 5 years ago when Rosemary first got in touch and let me know that this exhibition was in the offing. She was very excited. It's great to see that it's come to pass. I think of this exhibition as, my title for this exhibition is Rosemary's Baby. So today I'm going to talk about, obviously, a very well-known work by Richter, which, alas, is not in the show, October 18th, 1977. And I'm going to relate that to some works that are also not in the show for obvious reasons, because they either don't exist or have been covered up, and those are his East German mural paintings from the late 1950s. So those of you who know Richter's work will of course know this project, but I will nonetheless just go through the images in the series. Well, first of all, here's a couple of murals. Now, of course, a lot's been written about this series. It's been extensively discussed, and most often it's been discussed in relation to the idea of public memory, which is a big theme of Richter's. And so it's been discussed in terms of the manifest subject matter of the painting, which concerns the death of the leading members of the RAF terror group in Stammheim prison. And this has naturally attracted a lot of attention. And it's seen the works related to other images by Richter that relate to the theme of public memory, generally in the context of German history, but more recently in the case of this 9/11 related painting in relation to something that has had more of a global impact. But Richter's works don't just concern public memory, there's often a private mnemonic dimension to them as well. So Uncle Rudy is a great point here because it relates to both. On the one hand, it's a picture of a Nazi soldier produced and exhibited at a time in the 1960s when it was not common for people to discuss the war. But of course, it was Richter's own uncle at the same time, so there was a private and personal aspect to this. Betty, a reproduction of which is in the exhibition here. This is a picture of his daughter, which he painted in 1988, but the photo dates back to 1977. The abstract works also have a mnemonic dimension to them. So this is a great example, this painting here, not in the exhibition unfortunately, but I believe it's in Canberra, so you can see it in Australia. And you see these hyperboloid forms in the background. At this stage, he was either married to or about to be married to Isa Genskin, and so he's referencing those forms in the work. And then the title Juno, I believe, was a goddess who was a protector of women in ancient Rome. So this slide here echoes one of Dietmar's earlier on the subject of private experience in Richter's work. So he studied with Goetz in 62, 63 in Dusseldorf, and we look at this just very briefly, Richter working with the squeegee. Well, in his own practice, Goetz used a kind of squeegee as well. He would lay down pigment, and then he would scrape passages of the pigment off the canvas. And so anytime you can see a very clear contour in a work like this, it's where he's pulled paint away after having laid it down, and he used a very narrow, kind of flexible rubber blade, and Richter would later use a more rigid, often much larger blade. But when I spoke to Richter about the possibility of Goetz having had some impact on him in this regard, he said that that was quite likely to have been the case. Really struck by this abstract picture from '92, which has its very orthogonal kind of articulation of the surface, because whenever I see these works from the early 90s, I think of this little study that Richter made in 1959, one of his sort of private, tentative first engagements with abstract painting while he was still in East Germany, and you see that same sort of gesture being enacted, and it's almost as though he had unfinished business with that gesture, and then decades later he comes back to it in his abstract pictures. So most of us will know that these abstract pictures are built up in layers by stages, and by the time the painting's finished, the initial layers have long since been buried under pigment. And one thing Richter loves about this is the freedom it gives him to paint anything he likes to start with. Could be any old rubbish. He could just paint at random. He could try something like sort of geometric painting, which he doesn't often do, secure in the knowledge that it can just get covered up and no one will ever be the wiser as to what's underneath. And we don't have too many examples of the underlying layers of many of these paintings, but with this one, 1990, Forest No. 2, I'm struck by the resemblance to Manfred Kuttner. No idea if Kuttner was on Richter's mind at this time, whether there is in fact a relationship. This is a very suggestive parallel, and it makes me wonder, you know, if you could X-ray every single one of these paintings, what you might find underneath. But certainly the possibility of very interesting personal aspects to these paintings is there. Now, in terms of the role that memory plays in Richter's art, it tends to be linked up with this sort of the idea of what I would call unfinished business. So in the case of the October 18th paintings, there's this idea that some very difficult social events from the 1970s occurred in relation not just to what the terrorists did, but in how that related to the Nazi legacy. And in Richter's mind, these events weren't really satisfactorily processed or laid to rest, so there was unfinished business there. And so when he comes back to these events in 1988, what he's trying to do is prevent these memories from being kind of prematurely laid to rest, even though they haven't been resolved as yet. And then in the case of the picture of Betty, while he was reflecting on his relationship to his daughter, which hadn't been as close as he would like it to have been, and he would have liked to have that relationship to improve, and so there was unfinished personal business there. For me, it seems that in the early 80s, when he really embraced large-scale, quite differentiated abstract paintings that had a strongly gestural element to them, he still had in the back of his mind his experience of going to the Smythe Documenta exhibition in 1959 while he was still in the East, and this was an experience that played a big role in convincing him that he would need to leave East Germany if he was to make the sort of paintings he aspired to make. But it was not until the early 80s, I think, that he really started to figure out how he would inhabit this sort of idiom to his satisfaction. Now, he had, of course, made a lot of abstract work in the interim, but I think, as Dietmar has suggested in his talk, a lot of this was made in dialogue with then contemporary Western art trends. So you've got pop in the case of the Farbkarten, and then you've got minimalism, and then this red, blue, yellow painting is sort of minimal meets conceptual. It's conceptual in the sense that if you lay down the primaries, you can theoretically make an infinite number of paintings, but not until this period is he perhaps reaching back to the classic gestural abstraction of the post-war period. Not just that, but that's an aspect of it. And so for me, thinking about October 18th and this issue of memory and unfinished business, I start to wonder whether it didn't have something to do with his unfinished business with, first of all, socialism, and secondly, the socialist realist painting that he was kind of constrained to make in the East and became increasingly dissatisfied with. And so I think what might have been going on here is that this work kind of fulfilled the function of a cathartic farewell to some of the ideals of socialist collectivity, and also a sort of melancholic farewell to some of those ideals as well. And the reason I think that, I'll elaborate shortly about that, but the first reason is these paintings, October 18th paintings, to me, seem to sort of programmatically invert the prerogatives of socialist realism to a degree that I find really quite striking. And so to enumerate some of the aspects of this inversion, oh, I'm getting ahead of myself, I will just put this little quote up here first of all, because it indicates quite clearly that although Richter became tired of life in the GDR, he did have some investment in the ideals of socialism, I think, as many of us would, because on paper it all seems rather good, but when it came down to it, it really wasn't going to work in reality. And so when the RAF members began conducting acts of terrorism in the vain hope that they would somehow promote a revolution in West Germany, he had some sympathy for some of the ideals, certainly not for the means, but it wasn't entirely foreign to him, this idea of wishing society to be a better place and to perhaps be a more socialistic place. And I put up this image of Mao here because it crystallises that sense of distance he had from some of the ideals of socialism, and it's no accident that he made this edition in 1968 when some of these sentiments were running high in the West. Now, if we look at this image here, the joy of life, and I'm realising now I didn't properly introduce that work, so let me do that. Sorry, it's quite slow on the keyboard. All right, so this is The Joy of Life from 1956. This was his graduation work. He needed to complete this mural to graduate from the Dresden Academy where he'd trained. And what it shows, it's not the entire image, some of it's missing on the right, but it's a series of scenes in the life of a kind of young couple who are supposed to be living the ideal social life trajectory, and it shows them scenes of recreation and courtship, hanging out with their friends, and then by and by they grow older and they have a family, and the cycle kind of will presumably repeat itself, and it's shown in this very idyllic kind of pastoral landscape. There's very few indications of the industrialisation of East Germany, but if we could see the part of the painting that's missing, we'd see a tiny little tractor in the background that kind of says, P.S., we're a great industrial power, but don't worry, we live this rather lovely Garden of Eden type existence nonetheless. And so it's sort of a mildly propagandising image, but it's a propagandising image nonetheless, and it's intended to exhort people to live a certain life in conformity with the government's idea of what a good socialist life is. So this is one example of a painting he did in the East, and this one, which was in the Socialist Party headquarters in Dresden, which was really quite a prestigious commission, is much more classically socialist in its thematics. It shows a group of workers on the right-hand side of the image resisting the charge from a bunch of sort of mounted police on the left, and they're presumably protesting, and they're flying the red flag socialism, and it's a sort of generic image about, you know, the basis for the ongoing socialist revolution that's unfolding in the country, led by the party. So if I now just return to the joy of life, and I'm sort of proposing this as a kind of socialist realist archetype. So one of the reasons for that is it's a sort of a utopian, future-oriented and optimistic kind of a work. So socialist realist painting was supposed to depict reality in its revolutionary unfolding, but it was supposed to always be consistently upbeat so as to promote a sort of sense of progress towards utopia. And so it was, for this reason, it was idealised in service of ideology. And naturally, it would be affirmative of revolutionary collective activities. Also, the images were intended to be as kind of semantically closed and didactic as possible, because you want, you know, when you're making paintings for everybody and you've got a determinate point to make as the government, you want things to be very didactic and legible so that there's no misunderstanding, so that things can be consumed fast and your message is transmitted. Okay, this is not by Richter, but we need to remember that this work was in colour, and the immediacy and the vitality of colour was really important to socialist realist painting. There was an effective charge that came with that, and that was very important. So this Walter Womacker image was somewhat similar stylistically to Richter's work. Now with socialist realist images, every image is in a sense a synecdoche, so it's a part that stands in for a whole, and in this case the whole is a kind of the totality of socialist ideology and the worldview that it brought with it. So every image sort of refers to a totality beyond itself, and you're presumed to know what that is. If you don't, then socialist realism is not working very well. And then finally, I'd mentioned there's a sort of an orientation towards transcendence in a lot of these works, with faith in its attainability. So by transcendence, I mean the transcendence of humanity and society's current dilemmas towards their kind of definitive revolution in a socialist utopia. October the 18th, needless to say, is none of those things. Instead of being future-oriented and optimistic, it's retrospective and it's melancholy. Certainly refuses idealisation, and it refuses the ideology of the RAF. Instead of celebrating revolutionary collectivity, it mourns its failings. Instead of being highly legible and didactic, it's very open-ended, it's very obscure, both formally and semantically. He's not really telling you what to think about these events, he's simply proposing that you think about them again, and he's obscured his paintings in a way that suggests that this that is true to the kind of conflicted and unresolved nature of the events that they address, because depending on your social and your political views, you might have had very different ideas about what happened in 1977 and the years leading up to it, particularly whether the terrorists had been murdered by the government or not. There's a suppression of colour, and there's the mediation through photography, creates a kind of distancing effect that's very different from what would be hoped for with a socialist realist image. Instead of being a synecdoche referring to an already understood totality, every image is a kind of fragment, but the nature of the totality's not clear. There's a sort of field of events that's being referred to, but quite how you interpret those events is not mandated by anything that Richter's suggesting with the images themselves. And instead of being oriented towards transcendence, there's an orientation toward immanence. So, this is a work that suggests it's probably impossible for us to transcend all social and political difficulties. And that's one reason for its kind of melancholy tone. And then finally, instead of being a work about the joy of life, it focuses instead on the pain of death. So for this reason, I would think of it as a socialist realist antitype. Now, I'm not saying that Richter consciously intended it to be this way. There's no evidence to suggest that that's the case, but I am struck by the degree to which it is so firmly an inversion of the type of painting that he was making in the late 1950s. And so as I think about this in relationship to his life and his career as a whole, for me, I think it's related to a process that I've addressed in my research on Richter, a book I've been writing about his passage from East Germany to West Germany and how he negotiated that. And for me, one of the issues that concerned him was how you move from a collective society to an individualistic one and what is required there. And one aspect of that is that he went to the West because he wanted more individual freedom and he wanted to escape socialist collectivity because it was quite oppressive to him. But when he gets there, he finds, yes, he's got the freedom that he wants, but then what about the sense of belonging? What about how do you negotiate collectivity in the West? And there were different forms of shared experience, that sort of collectivity understood in that sense, available to him in the West, but for various reasons, they didn't work for him. He maybe didn't desire to affiliate with them. And so religion would have been one option, but he was fiercely anti-religious, so he paints this work of the Pope, but the Pope is kind of a vacant silhouette. Consumer culture was another one, the pleasures of consumer culture, but at least initially he was very resistant to that, and he paints this painting, which kind of suggests that if this was the horrors of the kind of recent past of Nazi Germany, there's something kind of, it's kind of dripping down and it's infecting this kind of beautiful but facade-like Wirtschaftswunder, so economic miracle kind of advertising imagery which comes from a toothpaste commercial. And then finally, Emma, nude on the staircase, of his wife, addresses the issue of family, and for various reasons Richter had difficulty having a secure kind of a family life, and eventually this relationship would end in divorce, and this was related to the Betty painting as well. So that would be three forms of collectivity which he sort of couldn't affiliate with. And then as Dietmar has outlined, friendship was really important too, but for various reasons these friendships break down. And so there were times when it was very difficult for Richter, so he was, he had the freedom all right, but what about the obverse? Now after 1988, so after he makes the October paintings, there are some changes. It's later in life, and his relationship towards these forms of shared experience changes. So in the mid-1990s, he marries Sabine Moritz, and they begin a new family, and he's much happier with his family life now, and although things are not perfect, nonetheless, he projects the image of being a contented family man. In terms of national identity, which was also addressed in Firing Squad, he had been ashamed to be German, and he was critical of so many aspects of German life. But by 1999, when he's asked to do a work for the Bundestag in the reunited Germany, he simply does a flag, which is kind of banal, but it at least affirms some sort of sense that now that the nation is back together, things could potentially go better now. And the reflective surface of this work kind of just throws that question back on whoever stands in front of it. He's not really answering the question, but he's at least willing to consider that it could be answered in the affirmative, that a reunited Germany could be able to put its problems behind it. And then, although he continues to profess that he doesn't believe in God, nonetheless he starts making the occasional religious work. And he's quite clear on the fact that he sees the church as an institution, the Catholic Church as an institution, as a sort of source of worldly comfort. It's not that God necessarily exists, far from it. He's described this window here as a kind of allegory of a chaotic, godless universe, but nonetheless this big cathedral that it's situated in kind of anchors and grounds and constrains that chaos. So for him, he's found a way to get some sort of sense of religious belonging. So bottom line is, he finally resolves this issue of how to balance individual freedom with collective belonging later in his life. And so, to conclude, when I look at October 18th and how it says farewell to socialist collectivity, which was, on paper, was fantastic, but really didn't work for him in reality, to me it seems to mark the beginning of that turning point. And I can't tell you why that occurred. It may not be possible to answer that at all, but for me, looking over the full spectrum of his career, this work, which is of course important for many other reasons, is also important as this kind of point of inflection in his career. Thank you.
I think we've got time for perhaps one, maybe two questions.
Yeah, just want to make sure.
Oh, can we just wait till you get the mic, because it's being recorded.
Thank you. You mentioned that after seeing Documenter 2, he decided he had to leave the GDR.
That was
so,
a contributing factor. Yes.
So is that established?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Oh, okay.
One other question at the back.
Thanks very much, Luke, for your fascinating talk. And I can't help but look at this, his graduating mural, to look at his in a critical tradition, to look at the employ of art historiography, because I can see he's referencing Matisse's Dancers and Dejeuners sur l'herbe, and then possibly Klimt with The Kiss, to kind of employ art historiography in a social realist kind of manner or way. Employing it to sort of start this tradition of social realism using notions of historiography, perhaps. It's just something that comes to mind.
Yes, there's definitely some clear prototypes in there. That's the Fête Champêtre for sure. The Joy of Life by Matisse would have been a bit of a dicey reference there because he would have been too modernistic. But perhaps repackaged in this way, that was more acceptable. I don't know. Entirely, but definitely full of nods to tradition. You've got that rear view nude, and so on. And he had to, I mean, he would have had to have demonstrated familiarity with acceptable traditional references to pass that test.
One more question? Well, we can always come back to it in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your patience today. Being the last of the day, I decided to cut the original ambition, which was to address Polka and Richter, but I've just focused on Richter for today. It makes sense. So I'll go through it. There are some touches, overlaps with a few things today, but particularly Luke, so we'll see how we go. Walter Benjamin once wrote that the photograph is, quote, the corpse of an experience. Eduardo Cardova, extrapolating from Benjamin's comment, suggests that, quote, history happens when something becomes present in passing away, when something lives in its death. Living means leaving traces. History happens with photography after life. There are many cases in which Richter explores this paradox, but what does this enigmatic formulation actually mean? For Benjamin, following the lead of art historians like Warburg, artworks have an afterlife, a Nachleben. Works live on after their creation. They are constructed and reconstructed in their afterlife. their reception changes. We understand works differently with time, with the intrusion of subsequent events, when new facts come to life, or in the wake of altered circumstances which change our earlier assessment. It's rather easy to point to places where Richter does something like this, thus seemingly verging on contradiction. In Notes of 1962, he argues, "The idea that art copies nature is a fatal misconception. Art has always operated against nature and for reason." In 1983, 2 decades later, he would declare, "Nature, quote, which is ourselves, is infinitely better, cleverer, richer than we, with our short, limited, narrow reason, can ever conceive." Does this mean then that art escapes the fatal misconception, that is, which thinks that art's role is to copy nature, only to find that art derives from our narrowest capacities, that is, human reason? This contradiction could be quite possible, and Richter might not deny it. In the past, Richter has complained, for instance, that art is, quote, wretched, cynical, stupid, helpless, perplexing. Sort of, you think it could go on forever, actually, but anyway. Perplexing and interesting, verwirrend, it's sort of confused as well. A mirror image of our own spiritual impoverishment, our state of forsakenness and loss. We have lost the great ideas, the utopias. We have lost all faith, everything that creates meaning. Then, virtually in the same breath, although actually it's written 10 days earlier, he postulates that art is, quote, the pure realisation of religiosity, of the ability to believe, longing for God. Art is human only in the absolute refusal to make a statement. End quote. Richter's wild equivocation between soaring romantic edicts of aesthetic transcendence and a nihilistic ridiculing of those same sentiments is symptomatic of a contemporary propensity to disparage absolutes or even universals, which are not quite the same, while similarly at the same time falling back on them. To point out the apparent contradictions is not the point, though. It is as if Richter seeks to participate in the afterlife of his own works by routinely recalibrating his thoughts. But there is more to it than this. He is willing to entertain contradictory formulations and somehow internalises equivocation in his rhetoric. He does so, however, in order to find a way out of an apparent morass. If works have an afterlife, then they also have a prehistory, which is equally impersonal and indifferent to any particular artwork or any artist who must confront it. The prehistory is comprised of the accumulated histories of styles, methods, and ways of seeing, which for Benjamin are historically malleable. They change with time. A prehistory and a post-history often collide, and the work, if it is sufficiently rich and evocative, becomes a dynamic access of this process. Meaning is continually resorted and recalibrated, just like Richter's own explanations. In the early 1960s, prehistory seemed to weigh heavily, more heavily than usual. Richter felt painterly tradition as an impediment. He was highly skilled and trained in the academic tradition, as we've seen today in East Germany, which did not translate directly to the West. Quote, I felt nonplussed and desperate to start with, he confessed in 1964. There seemed to be no place for his skills, and yet there was no denying abstraction, the ready-made, art informel, even conceptual art. Quote, what eventually set me free was the encounter with Fluxus and pop art, he says in the same notes of 64. To paint a photograph, he declared in 72, was a way of stripping away the layers of that accumulated prehistory. He needed to escape, quote, the stifling prototypes, the academy, the compulsion to stylise in accordance with his training. On the contrary, he says, if I paint a photograph, I can forget all the criteria that I get from these sources. I can paint against my will. Richter wants to know what to paint and what will succeed as painting. First, he turns to banal topics in order to avoid anything too loaded. I avoided everything that touched upon well-known issues, or any issues at all, whether painterly, social, or aesthetic." End quote. To paint a photograph, however, is an attempt to arrest it, to mark it out from the flow of images. One can keep turning the pages of a photograph album, keep scrolling on Instagram, idly scan through a magazine, or click through endless websites, and images just keep passing before our eyes. But as Richter pronounces in one of his earliest published statements, the impulse to do art or painting stems from, quote, "the effort to fix one's vision," end quote. The question is always to fix vision on what and how. Everything seems to be rendered banal, too available, almost redundant, and yet there still persists the demand of hope that he constantly invokes, as we've also seen today. To quote him again, "Something is demanded of art and of me, a kind of hope," end quote. The trouble is that one can drill down and extract all the impediments and start with the banal, where there are no apparent issues at all. But as Richter warned already in 1970, even this can turn into a style or a trademark, so I had to avoid letting the banal turn into my issue, end quote. Even worse, the resort to the banal only served to uncover the heavily loaded issues he initially started to avoid, or wanted to avoid. By the early 60s, Richter was part of a generation that could say, by that point, they were living in a vaguely prosperous life. They were no longer starving, I mean that literally, or living precariously, yet still something was not quite right. I want to look at 3 paintings. Family by the Seaside, 64 other things are there. Opening someone's photo album, while now almost a redundant exercise, can expose secrets that occasionally transfix one's gaze. Hence the term skeletons in the closet. But how does one know how to read it, how to detect what is before one's eyes? The banality Richter first embraces includes happy snapshots of family life. In these works, smiles abound as family members pose for their pictures, as demanded by convention. And it's in order to show that everybody is having a good time, relaxing and enjoying each other's company. Part convention, part good grace, one might say, the social photo demands a modicum of civility. So you have a man, a woman, flanked by 2 children, perhaps a sister on the left, a brother on the right, all grinning happily, carefree on vacation. There is very little blurring in this one. The styling is loosely modelled. The subject matter is Emma, Richter's wife, as a young girl at the beach on vacation. Straightforward enough. The much talked about Uncle Rudy immediately confronts the viewer with the unavoidable skeleton in the closet and the historical trace of a life that has become unfathomable, out of place, yet irredeemably historical. Uncle Rudy smiles for the camera in his Wehrmacht uniform. He is attentive, though somewhat at ease, yet also formal, gloves in hand, as if prepared for action or some imminent departure. He peers happily enough at the camera, almost smugly, which has led Rainer Rochlitz to comment, to quote, "His gaze is imbued with political blindness." Richter's uncle, Rudolf Schoenfelder, would soon die, as we've heard over the weekend, in World War II. He was therefore already dead when his portrait was painted. Reappearing from the dead in 1965, the whole resonance of the image has very different connotations. Although slightly blurred, the figure of Rudy is painted as if relatively solid compared to the background, which is blurred to such an extent that it looks as if the solid wall and the buildings are about to be swept away behind the unknown figure of Uncle Rudy. Animated and brooding, the image implies perhaps that Uncle Rudy too is in the cups of being swept away. The picture of Aunt Mariana, Tante Mariana, painted the same year as the portrait of Richter's Uncle Rudy. This is Rudy's sister. She features in an innocent enough childhood photograph with the artist as an infant. The only one not smiling in this whole sequence of fur he painted is the infant Richter, who is already displaying a characteristic frown that suggests he is already quizzical. He's confused by the setup he finds himself placed within. This would become a career path. We must remember that confused or perplexed is the description I used earlier applied to art. The apparently banal subject matter he wished to tackle proves not to be so banal after all. For Richter's aunt, Mariana, as we know, is also dead when the portrait is painted. In 1932, when Richter is born, she is a coy young teenage girl helping to support a young nephew propped up on pillows for his photographic portrait. This glimpse of family contentment is like a temporary respite from the bleakness, for Mariana suffered from schizophrenia. Not only that, she was forcibly sterilised and later exterminated under a Nazi euthanasia program aimed at eradicating all elements of social and biological ill health. The final twist, of course, was played out publicly when, unbeknownst to the artist, when he painted Family at the Seaside, a journalist would reveal that Emma's father, who is portrayed happily embracing this group, had worked for the euthanasia program that claimed the life of his incapacitated aunt. This is an example, if you like, of a very dark example of the afterlife of a work that transforms the happily banal image of his wife's family so that it acquires more sinister overtones and becomes a public spectacle. These are only banal images to the extent that they look like millions of other family snapshots stored in family albums around the world. History and art changes them. The secret behind the secrets is played out in public, and its resonance captures Richter himself in its net. This is just one way of explaining this formulation I used at the beginning. Living means leaving traces. History happens with photography after life. And this afterlife occurs whether intended or not. Even the exuberant, colourful portrait of Betty, the artist's daughter, as Luke's just talked about, suggests also a kind of loss, a kind of banal, everyday loss, yet nevertheless a poignant loss. On one level, it reads like the image of radiance, that spectre of pure realisation of hope that he still believes art can possess. On the other hand, you can read it as an image of a daughter who's a defiant adolescent daughter even, who is no longer willing to cooperate with her father's demands. No longer enjoying his company, she turns away to defy his needs to capture her portrait. This is another afterlife, this time the child who is beginning to slip away from the parent, just like the background appears to be washing away from Uncle Rudy. Betty turns away, so her portrait becomes, or her back becomes, a radiant spectre. Yet while in defiance of standard portraiture, she only turns away to face the grey void that is reminiscent, if not exactly, one of her father's grey monochrome abstract paintings. No matter where she turns, she cannot escape him. I want to look at then, finished with looking at a portrait that from the series Luke talked about, a final portrait to consider, which is also about escaping the gaze. It's in 3 parts. But it presents no radiant glow, as we've seen. If a photograph is the corpse of an experience and history becomes present in passing away, then what persists in the portrait of Gudrun Ensslin? Ensslin, it's called the Baader-Meinhof Bande or Baader-Meinhof Group, but she actually loses her name because it should have really been called the Baader-Ensslin Group, because she's the sort of ideological firebrand behind this group. Ensslin parades past the media pack on her way to a daily passage from her prison cell to this specially constructed courthouse within the boundaries of Stanheim Prison. Her portrait is in 3 parts, selected from 7 available press images, and I'll come to those in a minute. Enslin's the daughter of a pastor, a Protestant pastor, ironically just like Angela Merkel. She's not someone that Richter would normally identify with. She was the ideological firebrand of the RAF. She eventually hounded Meinhof to suicide in prison, and her exaltation of violence verges close to the fascism of her parents' generation that she deplored. I'll give you two quotes from her writing to Baader. Quote, this is Enslin. If we made a mistake, then we made a mistake. I actually don't see it myself. After all, what's been missing in the European fight for socialism over the last 100 years is the element of madness. Another quote, we are brutal with ourselves, and one of the consequences of this, this could have, is that we are all equally brutal and cold with everyone else. But that's what's missing, a stroke of the sword, a well-aimed bullet. She's actually talking that second quote about her love for Baader, so it's a bit of a confused metaphors, but anyway, it's interesting. Richter, by contrast, mastered the rhetoric of doubt, of equivocation, and the end of political pieties from the outset. His famous quotes go along the lines something like, we live, quote, without a plan, without an ideology, without all the world designs and the world pictures that never work, end quote. Then why paint this portrait? In the series, Enslin is the only figure to appear alive and living as an RAF member. Meinhof, as Luke showed you, is portrayed before she becomes a militant, and all the men are portrayed dead. You see her in prison, Enslin, and the image that Luke showed is actually her and Baader smiling during an earlier trial for arson. And you see they're passing a Marquis de Sade between themselves, giggling away and laughing. Her casual glance to someone she recognises as the focal point, and this shows you the series that Richter gets the paintings from, and you can see it's his marking up of the photographs to see where he wants to decide to focus, and the sequence goes like that. So basically what it is, she's walking through, something catches her attention, she looks up, and then she keeps going through as if that way to the trial. The one he leaves out is the one at the end when she comes back sneering. So the casual glance to someone she recognises is the focal point of the portrait. So I'll just come back to that one. Incarcerated, trying to ignore the calls from the media pack, Enslin detects something that averts her trained gaze on the floor in an attempt to bypass the spectacle. What is it that grabs her attention? One familiar voice from amidst the throng of clicking press cameras, TV lights, newspaper journalists calling for attention, onlookers, voyeurs, supporters. A familiar face, perhaps, amidst all this cacophony, amidst the spectacle she and her group have become. The thing to notice then, as I mentioned, is that the original sequence removes the defiance of the last picture, when she is sneering for this assembled mob. This allows a different quality to emerge in the tripartite portraiture. Enslin appears then hesitant, more subdued than strident. She's much like a tentative ghost, startled at being summoned back from the grave. This grainy depiction, as if sliding between registers, as though caught in a fleeting moment of realisation and fading away from it, echoes Enslin's uncertainty as she is compelled to confront one short instant of recognition of the familiar amongst a sea of unfamiliarity. Then she looks away. Enslin's portrait is best understood as a portrait of fleeting recognition. It is a painting of that moment disrupted. As such, it is also possible to think of it, I would argue, as a type of self-portrait, even as unlikely as this appears to be. Richter recognises that despite everything, the RAF still stood for hope in politics. If history happens when something lives in its death, to recall Benjamin at the beginning, then Richter seeks to point to that optative appeal that has not been distinguished, despite the carnage around the Baader-Meinhof episode, despite the hopes that ended in misery, murders, death, a suicide, abandoned children resentful of their parents' generation. Within that morass, Richter still glimpses hope. And we cannot, and like as Benjamin declares, we cannot rest easy when there is suffering in the world. This is all part of the legacy of this group. Richter unexpectedly is caught still identifying, still looking, captured by that call that initially inspired Ensslin herself. We recognise Enslin's penchant for violence, though, as being barely distinguishable from the Nazi generation that she deplored, that preceded her, and from the repressive German state of that time. Their victory, if it was a victory, was to unwind those conditions of repression. Yet Richter also experienced enough of the zealots who believe they were always right, no matter what, because their ideology confirms the legitimacy of their actions, and it confirms it in advance, irrespective of what they actually do. The identification of the vanguard as Destiny's co-pilot is what is being recognised and disrupted in this portrait. As a portrait and as an image of interruption, the work can be understood as a barb that tears into what that was once recognisable as valid, and this is history present in what has passed from us, that we no longer recognise it as the same. Yet there is the spectre of hope, and this is why Richter could recognise that appeal. It still triggers authentic action in the world. He might say that we have lost all faith, and hence everything that creates meaning. But he could still paint the Baader-Meinhof for this reason, whereas he said at the time, the concentration camps were simply too horrible. It is perhaps apt then that the Birkenau pictures can be painted only by withdrawing them from this proliferating circuit of imagery, from the spectacle. This is to arrest them in a completely different way. Whatever Ensslin responds to in her three-part portrait, this moment of arrested attention is the subject of the portrait. It is the moment similar to that found in Uncle Rudy too, and also in Aunt Mariana, the portrait of Betty, or even the Birkenau series, oddly enough. These are all scenes of confrontation. History is played out with intense weight, at the most familiar level and the most unfamiliar level at the same time. We have lost faith in the great certainties, Richter proclaims, but he wants to create meaning from this situation nonetheless. To conclude then, what I say is we face different contradictions today. Richter's practice, like that of his adversary and friend, Polka, stems from confronting seemingly irresolvable and insurmountable contradictions and making it their field of possibility. But they also acknowledge there's no safe place above and beyond these field of possibilities. From that seemingly tenuous situation, they made what was never before viable transform into a new possibility. Following Richter, then, we can learn that even in the face of perplexity of an impossible situation, we still strive to negotiate it while remaining aware, in fact, aware all too often, that the situation we find ourselves in grasps us as much as we grasp it. Thanks.
No, not let you off that easily. Any questions? We've got time for some questions before we take a break. Okay, I'll start. What can I ask you?
Everyone's exhausted.
Yeah, probably. In terms of history painting, how do you, I mean, obviously the other series is being figurative is more easy to understand in terms of history painting. How would you see the four abstracts in terms of that genre?
Well, what I was thinking about actually was that, you know, is every work of Richter's successful, as they may know? And what I was thinking about this idea of the barb as a portrait was, it is a sort of way of thinking. If you look at what he and Rodham said they were confronting, they were confronting a type of impasse, so they had to work around it. So I was thinking that maybe the barb is quite an interesting way of thinking about these portraits, because it's both something that sort of not stitching skin together. It's a violent sort of metaphor, but it is putting together something that rips in, but also pulls something together. So, and I think that's really the interesting way. You can think of barbs in these various ways. I think maybe Stefan's way of negotiating those hybrids is a type of barb, perhaps, but these are a way of thinking about, amongst all these images, what really works and why. And that's what I was trying to do, think about why certain works really work for me. That's essentially it.
I'm curious to know about what you would think of his later work, because what we have seen today is very much about what he did in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I always thought that an artist progresses in his life and his best work is towards the end of his life. So what do you think of the work done later in the 2000s, the one we see in the movie? All his abstract work where he seems to be taking a distance from intellectual work and going towards more the aesthetic work, the painting itself for the sake of painting. Seems like it hasn't been covered today, but what do you think of that section of his life as a production?
Well, it's always hard when you do a paper, it's about something specific, and someone asks you, what about all the other stuff? But I could try and do something. But that means, probably a question better for the panel afterwards, I think, actually, because we don't know what each other was speaking about, and so we had to choose something, and so I just want to focus on what I thought was interesting. But there is one interesting suggestion, this idea about this progression through life. I think if it's anything that I would have said if I'd put Polker and Richter together, would be to say that both of them confront the possibility that you could, it's a field of negotiation and you do things and you can go back to things and so forth. So this idea of this is a lineage from one thing to the other and they cumulatively progress is something I think they were seeing as an impediment by that stage and trying to think of things differently. So, yeah, that's all I could say, probably. But you can ask that question again later. Rosemary will answer it.
Thank you.